Crusaders versus Egypt, 1249 AD. The Battle of Mansurah. The Nile that ate the Crusaders. These words hang like a shadow over one of the strangest moments in medieval war. A moment when an entire army, led by a king, stepped into a land where the river itself became a weapon. In the winter heat of 1249, the Crusaders believed they were unstoppable. They marched toward Mansurah with the confidence of prophecy, banners lifted high, convinced that Egypt would fall like a door already halfway open. Yet within days, the Nile would swallow men whole. Not by chance, not by storm, by design. A single misstep turned triumph into disaster. A single crossing changed the fate of thousands. And standing on that riverbank was a young commander whose name the Crusaders barely knew, but whose presence would turn the tide of the entire campaign. What he understood about the Nile, they never even imagined. One moment in this story still sits in silence, unresolved, a moment when the Crusaders believed they had escaped the trap, unaware that the real danger had only just begun. And everything that follows begins right there. The river of prophecy. They said the Nile moved like a living creature, patient and watchful, changing its face with the moon. But on the morning the Crusaders reached its banks, the river looked harmless, almost welcoming. The men didn't see danger. They saw a road, a glittering path toward Cairo, toward victory, toward the kind of glory kings carve into stone. Louis IX stood at the water's edge, his boots sinking into soft mud, listening to the river's quiet hiss. Behind him, the army waited, knights restless, priests murmuring prayers, thousands of men convinced they were part of a divine moment. Yet Louis felt something else brushing the back of his mind, a faint unease he couldn't name. It wasn't fear. It was the sense of being watched. The Egyptians had vanished from sight 2 days earlier, leaving the fields strangely empty. No arrows, no cavalry, no banners on the horizon. Only silence, and the river not far away, hidden behind a thin line of palm groves. A young commander studied the Crusaders through the shimmer of heat. His name was Baybars, untested by European standards, but forged by hardship long before any knight heard of him. He watched their confidence, their bright armor, their bold formation, and he felt no intimidation. He only wondered how long it would take before they noticed the truth. The Nile was rising. Louis' advisors insisted the waters were low enough to cross. The maps said the canals were shallow. The scouts swore the path was clear. Yet as Louis knelt and touched the surface, it felt different, heavier, darker, carrying a strange warmth as if it had swallowed something moments before. Still, the army pushed forward. They built bridges, drove stakes into the sand, tested the current with ropes. Men joked as they worked, trying to chase away the tension that hung over them like thick smoke. But even their laughter sounded hollow, as if the land itself absorbed the sound. Then came the first sign, a body drifting. By dot, it turned slowly in the current. Face down, armor still strapped to its back. The men froze. No one recognized the crest. This wasn't one of theirs, yet the corpse was fresh, hours old. Maybe less. Louis's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. He looked upstream, searching for movement, a shadow, anything that explained this silent warning. But the river gave nothing. Night settled with unnatural stillness. The campfires flickered without warmth, and the men slept lightly, waking at every rustle. Somewhere in the darkness, something splashed, a heavy, purposeful sound. But each time torches approached the riverbank, all they found was rippling water. Before dawn, Louis called his commanders. Their decision was simple: move. They believed hesitation would only embolden the Egyptians. And perhaps Louis wanted to silence the unease inside him by proving that the river was nothing more than water and superstition. At first light, The Crusaders began crossing. The initial steps were easy. The water rose to the men's ankles then, to their knees. Sunlight danced harmlessly on the surface. The far bank looked close enough to touch. Louis watched the first formation wade forward and felt tension thin in his chest. Perhaps he had imagined the river's warning. Then he heard it. A low, distant roll like thunder, though the sky was clear. The current shifted. Men stumbled, boots dragging as if caught by hands beneath the surface. Horses snorted, hooves skidding on unexpected mud. The calm water thickened into a swirling brown haze. Another body surfaced, downstream. This one wore Egyptian armor. Baybars watched from the palms, barely breathing, waiting for the moment when confusion turned to fear. He had timed this precisely. The release of upstream canals, the silent opening of floodgates in the night. He knew the land. He knew the river's mood. And he knew the Crusaders had put their faith in naps, drawn by men who had never truly understood Egypt. A shout rose from the water. Someone vanished beneath a sudden whirlpool. A knight reached out to grab him, but the current snatched both, dragging them sideways. Panic rippled through the line as formation dissolved into splashing chaos. Louis mounted his horse, shouting orders, urging the men to hold steady. But the river wasn't listening. It grew stronger, pushing against armor, tugging at shields like claws. The earlier confidence shattered. Men clung to each other, gasping as the current pulled at their legs. And then, as if the river had simply decided it had taken enough, the current eased, the water settled. Silence returned. The Crusaders stood soaked and shaken, but alive. Most reached the opposite bank. Their relief came with nervous laughter, forced and thin. They believed they had survived the worst. They believed they had slipped past whatever trap the Egyptians had prepared. Only Louis didn't share their relief. The river had behaved with intention, too sudden, too precise. He felt as if they had stepped through a door someone else had opened for them. On the far side, the land narrowed into a long canal road carved between muddy embankments. It forced the Crusaders into a tight column, unable to spread out, unable to maneuver. But the path seemed empty, quiet, harmless. Baybars smiled as he watched them advance. The Crusaders marched deeper into the narrow passage, their boots sinking, their armor coated in Nile silt. Every step echoed strangely, as if the ground was hollow beneath their feet. Louis's horse snorted and tossed its head, uneasy for reasons it couldn't explain. Up ahead, the canal bent slightly to the left, hiding whatever lay beyond. This was the moment Baybars had been waiting for. He lifted his hand. A single falcon cry pierced the still air. From behind the bend, a roar erupted, not from men, but from hooves. Egyptian cavalry burst from the curve, rising out of the haze like ghosts, shields gleaming, spears angled low. They moved with terrifying speed, the narrow road amplifying the sound of their charge, until it felt like the earth itself was rushing toward the Crusaders. Louis's front line reeled backward, trapped between the sudden onslaught and the deep canal behind them. Horses screamed. Men stumbled. The tight passage turned the Crusader formation into a tangled mass with no room to swing a sword. For a heartbeat, Louis considered retreat, but before he could speak, something else struck him. A whisper of movement behind the Crusader ranks. It wasn't cavalry. It wasn't infantry. It was something far worse. Louis turned, and his face drained of color. Behind them, the river had begun to rise again. The walls of Mansurah, the river's slow rise behind them, felt like a cold hand closing around the Crusader's spine. Louis turned in the saddle, watching the brown water creep over the embankment, silent and steady, as if it had been waiting for this exact breath in time. The men closest to the canal felt it first. They stepped back instinctively, boots sinking into soft mud, fear flickering in their eyes. What moments earlier had looked like a harmless current now looked alive. Ahead, the Egyptian cavalry held their line, horses pawing the earth, eyes glinting through dust and sunlight. The road had become a narrow throat with no room to breathe. The Crusaders stood trapped between river and riders, and for the first time since landing in Egypt, Louis felt the weight of someone else's plan tightening around him. A single horn sounded in the distance, long, low, and steady. It came from Mansurah. Louis had expected a city in panic. He imagined frightened citizens barricading their gates, praying from rooftops. Instead, Mansurah remained eerily silent, its walls calm, its gates closed without haste. The city seemed to watch the Crusaders without fear, as if it knew something Louis didn't. Baybars, hidden behind the cavalry line, watched the confusion. He needed only a few more moments. The river wasn't rising fast enough yet. The cavalry wasn't meant to break the Crusaders. It was meant to hold them in place. A snare needs stillness before it tightens. The Crusaders slowly pushed forward, raising shields, trying to form something resembling a battle line. Louis gave the order, not with fire, but with restraint. Every move needed to be careful. His horse stepped sideways, nostrils flaring at the scent of the river behind them. The Egyptian cavalry shifted just enough to stir dust, but did not attack. Louis frowned. That hesitation wasn't fear. It was control. A deliberate slowing of the moment. A waiting. A thin shiver crawled through him. Something beyond the cavalry. Something behind those walls. Something he could not yet see. Had already chosen where this confrontation would end. He glanced at the river again, not it had risen another inch. The Crusaders advanced from necessity, not courage. Their armor clinked with nervous rhythm, breaths short and uneven. Every pair of eyes darted between the approaching riders and the creeping river. The canal walls felt too tight now, almost closing in. Then a sudden shout erupted on the left flank, a knight crying out that the ground beneath him was giving way. Men turned to see him sinking knee-deep into wet soil. A second man slipped, his shield vanishing beneath mud. The river hadn't just risen. It had softened the battlefield. Baybars saw it and nodded once. The cavalry surged a few steps forward, not a charge. A shove. The Crusaders panicked, pushing backward, pressing into each other. Shields locked unintentionally. Helmets clapped together. Horses reared in confusion. The whole column compressed into a trembling mass of metal and fear. Louis shouted to hold the line, but the noise of splashing water, shifting mud, and pounding hooves swallowed his voice. In that chaos, something unexpected flashed across the Egyptian formation. A gap opened, small, intentional, almost inviting. Louis saw it immediately. So did the men near him, and for a moment it appeared as though the Egyptians had miscalculated, offering the Crusaders an escape route. Men surged toward it, driven by instinct more than strategy, and Baybars smiled again. The gap closed the moment the Crusaders reached it. Riders slammed inward from both sides, trapping the front ranks in a pincer of shields and spear points. It wasn't meant to slaughter, just to stop movement completely. A violent freeze. Behind the Crusaders, the river climbed another inch. The current thickened. A few men lost footing and plunged waist-deep into the darkening water. Panic rose. Like steam from armor, Louis realized something crucial in that instant. The Egyptians didn't need to defeat the Crusaders on open field. They only needed to hold them in this narrow strip, long enough for the river to finish the work. He pushed forward, swinging his sword flat against the backs of his own men, forcing them into order, trying to carve space where there was none. The river reached the knees of the back ranks. Someone screamed that they saw bodies in the water, more than before. drifting like silent warnings. Louis's breath grew tight. This could not continue. They had to break free or be swallowed. He raised his sword high, catching sunlight in the blade, and shouted an order to push toward the cavalry with every ounce of strength they had left. For the first time, the Egyptian riders pulled back. Just a few steps. It looked like fear. It looked like retreat. The Crusaders surged forward with desperate hope. They believed they had forced the enemy to yield. They believed the path to Mansurah might open if they pressed hard enough. But retreat was exactly what Baybars wanted them to see. As the Crusaders lunged ahead, forcing momentum into the narrow road, they didn't notice the river behind them, finally breaking over the canal wall. A heavy wave rolled into the passage, swallowing the footprints they'd left minutes earlier. Mud turned to slurry. Armor grew heavy with water. The road began to disappear under the Nile's creeping body. Up ahead, Mansurah's gates trembled. Not from fear, not from collapse, from within. They cracked open just enough for one man to step out. A tall figure in dark robes. A signal bearer. He drove his staff into the ground, planting a banner deep into the mud. The city wasn't preparing for siege. It was summoning the rest of the army. Louis watched the gates widen and felt his heart thud once, heavy, slow, before dropping into cold realization. They hadn't reached Mansurah. They had been led to it. Behind him, the river surged again, stronger than before, as if it had been waiting for that exact moment. The back ranks cried out. Some pulled off their feet. Others dragged sideways into swirling water. Ahead, Egyptian infantry emerged from the city in disciplined waves. The cavalry shifted formation. The river kept rising. And Louis, standing between a drowning canal and an advancing army, understood the truth too late. The battlefield wasn't a mistake. It was a design. The crossing that should never have happened. The first sound Louis heard was the river's breath. Not the gentle murmur of water slipping over stone, but a heavy exhale, as if the Nile itself had awakened. The canal behind the Crusaders widened, with each heartbeat swallowing the banks that had carried them moments earlier. Men staggered backward as the mud beneath their feet dissolved, turning the battlefield into shifting ground yet in front of them. Mansurah's infantry advanced with quiet control, their steps steady, their eyes fixed on the narrowing strip of dry earth. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They moved as if they knew exactly how this moment would unfold. Louis realized something unsettling. The Egyptians weren't fighting them for space. They were guiding them toward a single point, a choke inside a choke, a funnel within the funnel. The Crusaders had crossed the Nile, believing it to be an advantage. Now, standing between a rising river and an opening city, they understood why the Egyptians had let them cross so easily. This was the true battlefield, not the riverbank, not the fields. This narrow channel of earth, this was where the story had been waiting for them. Louis raised his sword again, though his hand felt heavier than before. Mud splashed up the horse's legs as it shifted nervously beneath him. The animal sensed danger faster than the men did, its ears flicking back at the sound of water pounding against the canal walls. The first wave of Egyptian infantry stopped within 10 paces of the Crusader front line. They didn't attack. They held their shields high, forming a wall that felt colder than steel. Behind them, more soldiers streamed out of Mansurah, until the entire road seemed filled with dark armor and unreadable faces. The Crusaders' breath caught in their throats. One of Louis's commanders leaned in and whispered that they must strike before the river cut off the retreat entirely. Louis knew he was right, but he also knew the Egyptians were waiting for that first desperate charge. Still, he had no choice. Louis gave the order. The Crusaders surged forward with the last strength their legs could muster. Their boots pushed through mud that clung like hands dragging at them, slowing them. The river's roar grew louder behind them. Shields slammed. Spears met steel. The narrow road turned into a crush of bodies fighting for inches. Louis forced his horse forward, swinging with the determination of a man who knew fate was closing in. Every step felt like resistance against something invisible. The Egyptians were not trying to break the Crusaders. They were trying to exhaust them, to let the river finish what steel began. A light wind brushed the battlefield unexpectedly. Warm, almost comforting. It carried the scent of the city, spices, smoke, the faintest trace of incense. That momentary calm felt out of place, a brief breath in the middle of chaos, and it unsettled Louis more than the clash of blades. Then something shifted. A distant rumble rolled across the fields, so soft Louis wondered if he had imagined it. But the Egyptian infantry heard it too. Their formation changed subtly, as if reacting to a signal the Crusaders could not hear. The rumble grew dot. It came from the river. A dark surge of water burst through the far side of the canal, sweeping away torches, drowning patches of earth, sending men scrambling up the embankment. The river wasn't just rising, it was moving. A force shaped by human hands, released with intention. For the first time that day, fear broke fully across the Crusader ranks. Louis' men pressed forward instinctively, slamming into the Egyptian shield wall with a desperation that bordered on panic. But the wall didn't buckle. It didn't crack. It simply absorbed the weight, letting their panic drive them deeper into the trap. Another roar from the river pushed the back ranks even closer, and Louis felt the pressure swell like a wave behind him. His men were being crushed between water. And steel-dot he knew they couldn't sustain this. He also knew the Egyptians could. Sudden opening appeared in the Egyptian formation, a small hole, barely wide enough for a few men. It seemed to shimmer in the dust as sunlight cut through it. Some Crusaders saw it and rushed toward it, believing it to be a breach. Louis shouted for them to hold, but his voice disappeared into the clang of battle. The first soldiers reached the gap dot and vanished into the street. Beyond dot, Louis felt a jolt run through him. The Egyptians weren't circling for a kill. They were letting the Crusaders spill into Mansurah itself. That wasn't mercy. That was invitation. Louis spurred his horse, pushing toward the opening, unwilling to let his men rush blindly into the unknown. The Egyptian infantry stepped aside just long enough for a surge of Crusaders to spill through, then closed the line behind them like a door. Louis barely made it through before the shield wall shut tight, separating him from half his army. Inside the city's outskirts, he found himself in a labyrinth of narrow streets. Smoke curled from the rooftops. Shadows shifted behind windows. And ahead, he saw Crusader banners fluttering as men ran deeper into the maze. Believing victory waited at the end of each turn. But Louis felt something else. This city was not in panic. It was in position. Cries echoed from the alleys. Not battle cries. Warnings. The Crusaders who ran ahead did not return. Their footsteps vanished into stone corridors that swallowed sound. Louis dismounted, forcing his way through a broken archway, trying to find a path wide enough to regroup. The river's roar now faded, replaced by the unsettling quiet of Mansurah's inner streets. The air felt dense, as if the city held its breath for him alone. He turned a corner and froze. A line of Egyptian foot soldiers stood ready, shields pressed against the walls on both sides, leaving only a thin passage open down the center. Their eyes followed him calmly. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. Louis stepped back, heart hammering, realizing the scale of the trap. The river behind him had never been the endgame. It had been the push. The true snare lay in the city's bones, in the narrow paths where an army's size became a weakness. One of his remaining captains shouted from behind, urging him to retreat back through the archway. Louis turned. The arch was no longer open. Egyptian. Cavalry had circled behind them, blocking the passage he'd come through. Their horses stood still as statues, their riders silent, watching. The river had sealed the back. The infantry had sealed the front. The city had sealed the inside. Louis felt the world tighten around him, shrinking to the width of a single street. Somewhere in the maze beyond, a single Egyptian horn sounded once, sharp and clear, echoing off stone. It was not a call. It was a signal. The night the river turned red night did not fall over Mansurah in a gentle descent. It arrived like a curtain pulled by unseen hands, dropping shadows into every alley, every window, every narrow bend of the city. Torches flickered against stone walls, their flames thin and unsteady, as if they too sensed the chaos ready to break loose. Louis stood in the center of a cramped street, his armor smeared with mud and river silt, his breath sharp with exhaustion. Around him, the remnants of his vanguard pressed together, searching the darkness for movement. Their footsteps echoed strangely, swallowed by the maze of homes and markets that wound deeper into the city. Behind them, the canal roared like a wounded beast. The river had pushed so far inland that its distant roar vibrated through the stone beneath their boots. The men did not understand how this could happen, but Louis did. The Egyptians had opened the water. The land itself had turned against them. Somewhere, above, on one of the rooftops, a tile shifted. A faint scrape. A soft thud. Louis raised his sword instinctively, scanning the shadows between doorways and wooden beams overhead. Mansurah felt alive, like a creature breathing around them. Then a scream ripped through the street ahead. The Crusaders surged forward, weapons raised, swallowing their fear with force. But when they reached the next bend, there was no enemy waiting. Only one of their own men, staggering backward, clutching his side. His eyes were wide, unfocused, as if he had glimpsed something impossible. Before Louis could reach him, arrows rained from above. Black shafts streaked down from the rooftops, glinting red in the torchlight before burying themselves into armor and flesh. Men collapsed instantly, shouting in confusion. The street became a cage with no roof, only death falling from the night sky. Louis shouted for shields, but the street was too narrow. The men lifted what they could anyway, forming a crooked canopy. Arrows thudded into wood and metal, yet the angles were relentless. The city had chosen every street with purpose. Baybars had not needed to chase them. He had simply guided them to the place where the city did the chasing for him. Louis pushed forward, carving a path through the confusion, trying to reach a wider road where his men could breathe. He felt the weight of every life pressing on his shoulders. Each step deeper into Mansurah felt heavier than the last. Ahead, he saw a wider opening, a market square dimly lit by a single torch hanging from a tilted pole. It seemed abandoned, silent, but silence in Mansurah had not brought comfort all day. Still, they had no choice. Louis gestured for his men to move. The surviving Crusaders stumbled into the open space. For the first time since entering the city, the sky opened above them. A cold breeze drifted across the square, carrying a scent of wet earth and something metallic. The torchlight flickered against the wooden stalls and empty crates scattered across the ground. The square looked deserted. And then Louis noticed something. Subtle. Too deserted. Too untouched. Too perfectly arranged. He stepped forward slowly, feeling the air shift around him. A faint creak sounded behind one of the stalls. Footsteps slid across stone. A whisper so soft it could have been the wind echoed from the shadows. Louis lifted his sword just as the Egyptians struck. They poured from the alleys like a tide of shadows, moving with terrifying precision. There, blades gleamed white. Their eyes held neither rage nor mercy, only purpose. Crusaders scrambled to defend themselves, forming a half-circle around Louis. The clash of steel rang against the walls, sending sparks into the air. His fight was different. There was no river pushing them, no cavalry hurting them. This was steel against steel, face to face, within the beating heart of Mansurah. Louis fought with the determination of a man who refused to accept the shape of fate. He parried a blade aimed at his throat, swung hard, and forced an opening. For a brief moment, he broke through the line. Glimpsing a path leading toward what looked like a main street dock, he pushed toward it. A handful of Crusaders followed, desperate to stay near their king. They clashed with stragglers, slipping on blood-slick stones. The square dimmed behind them, swallowed in screams. Louis kept moving. Turn after turn, he led his dwindling group through the city's arteries, trying to escape the tightening noose. But the alleys were narrowing. Each path they took seemed to bend inward, looping them back toward the center of Mansurah, like a labyrinth designed to confuse foreign feet. One of his captains caught up, breath ragged, armor dented. He whispered that the army outside the city walls was scattered. The river had separated the Crusaders still on the far bank. Some had tried to cross back, only to be swept away. Others searched blindly for the king in the rising water. Louis closed his eyes. Briefly, the river hadn't just swallowed the path. It had split his army into pieces. A distant clang shattered his thoughts. Footsteps thundered from the right, growing louder, closer. Louis spun toward the sound, raising his sword, but it wasn't Egyptian infantry appearing from the shadows. It was Crusaders. 20 men, soaked to the bone, armor drenched with river. Mud emerged from a side alley. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with terror. They shouted that the river had burst through the canal walls, that the water had flooded half the outer road, that dozens of horses had been dragged under, that more troops had vanished beneath the waves. Louis felt the air leave his chest in a single cold exhale. The Nile had waited for nightfall. Now, with darkness shrouding the battlefield, it could strike unseen. The men barely had time to catch breath before another sound rose in the distance. A horn. Not Egyptian. Crusader. But it was distant, too distant. A single call swallowed by the city's walls. Louis's eyes widened. That horn meant survivors were still out there, somewhere beyond the maze. A rally point, a signal of hope. But reaching it would require carving through streets filled with enemy soldiers, and getting past the places where the river had flooded. The ground. The men around him looked at him with desperate, pleading eyes. Louis lifted his sword slowly, not to charge, not to surrender, but to choose a direction. Before he could speak, the ground beneath them trembled. A low vibration slid through the stones, rattling the walls, carrying the unmistakable sound of water forcing its way through a barrier. The Nile was coming into the city. Louis tightened his grip on his sword as the first droplet seeped from a distant alley, dark and glistening, crawling toward their boots. In the silence that followed, the men understood. They were running out of streets, running out of air, running out of choices. The king who walked into captivity, the first sign that the night was turning against them, came in the smallest possible way. A drip of water sliding across the street, curling around Louis's boot like a finger tracing a name. It was gentle, almost peaceful, yet every man around him felt its meaning. The river had found them again. Louis stared at that thin ribbon of water, and at the narrow alley it had come from. If the Nile was inside Mansurah's streets, the city was no longer a battlefield. It was a drowning maze. He turned to the exhausted men at his side. Their armor sagged on their shoulders, blades chipped, eyes hollow from hours of confusion and fear. Still, they looked to him for direction, for a path out of the tightening noose. Louis forced breath into his lungs. The river hadn't taken his voice yet. He told them they had one chance, reached the distant horn before the water sealed. Every escape they followed without hesitation, not because they believed the way was safe, but because standing still felt like surrender. The group slipped into a wider street where the moonlight reached the ground more clearly. The sky had cleared after sunset, leaving sharp white light cutting across the rooftops. It illuminated the water, creeping along the cracks between stones. Slowly, like a patient hunter, Louis picked a direction and moved. The men followed in a scattered line, watching both the ground and the rooftops above. Every shadow felt alive. Every silence felt like a warning. Then came a faint sound, metal brushing against metal. The men froze. Louis lifted his sword. Out of the darkness on their left, a small group of Egyptian soldiers stepped forward. Not a full regiment, not a wave of infantry. Just 6 men, moving in a slow, deliberate line that blocked the street completely. Louis knew what small groups meant. They weren't there to fight. They were there to delay, to stall, to let something larger happen elsewhere. Behind him, the water grew thicker, spreading faster now. Louis clenched his jaw. They couldn't stop to fight. They had to break through. He ordered the men forward. The clash was brief but brutal. The Egyptians fought without shouting, their movements sharp and precise. One Crusader fell instantly, his armor ringing out against stone. Louis pushed ahead with a desperate strength he hadn't known he still possessed. A blade grazed his arm. Another scraped across his shield. He forced his way through the resistance, dragging the remaining soldiers with him until the line broke. They stumbled into another street, panting, limping, bleeding. But they were still moving. The distant horn sounded again, faint but clearer. For the first time in hours, Louis felt a thread of hope tighten in his chest. Survivors were not just signaling. They were waiting. He pushed on. The street ahead widened into an open quarter, but the moment they stepped into it, Louis felt something shift in the air. A wrongness, a tension without noise. A soft rumble echoed from the right. Every man turned. Water burst from a collapsed wall, flooding into the quarter with shocking speed. Stones tumbled in the wave, wooden beams snapped, and the ground seemed to shake as the river tore through a row of abandoned stalls. The men scrambled backward as the waves slapped into the open space, rising to their shins within moments. Louis steadied himself, using a broken post to avoid being swept off his feet. The men behind him shouted as the water surged again. One stumbled, losing his grip. Louis lunged forward and grabbed his wrist, pulling him upright with a force fueled by instinct more than strength. The man coughed river water and nodded gratefully. Louis didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something approaching through the floodwater. Torches, 3 of them, carried by mounted soldiers. Baybars' riders cut through the water with unnerving calm, their silhouettes framed by the burning light behind them. They didn't raise their weapons. They simply observed, noting Louis's position, the state of the men with him, the water rising around them. Louis realized what they were doing. They were not trying to kill him. They were circling to drive him somewhere. The riders turned left at the edge of the quarter and vanished. Louis wiped the water from his face and gestured forward. The men followed, moving as quickly as their soaked armor allowed. The water slowed them, pulling at their legs, weighing them down. At the next turn, they reached a street that sloped upward. Finally, an advantage. Higher ground meant distance from the flood. They hurried toward it, pushing themselves harder, their breaths ragged. A single Egyptian stood at the top of the slope, not a soldier, a man in a dark robe, carrying no weapon. Louis slowed instinctively. The robed figure looked down at him for a moment, then stepped backward, disappearing into the alley behind him. Louis hesitated. That path would lead them deeper into unfamiliar territory. But behind them, The water crept closer, carrying debris and broken wood with it. They climbed the slope, led them through a narrow lane where the houses leaned inward, creating a roof of interlocking shadows. Every sound bounced off the walls, amplified by the stone like whispers, murmuring from every direction. Ahead, a courtyard opened, small, surrounded by high walls, with a single tree growing in the center. Its branches hung low, droplets of water clinging to the leaves like glass beads. Louis stepped in and froze. Figures emerged from the dark edges of the courtyard. First 5, then 10. Then more. Egyptian soldiers surrounded the courtyard in a silent, tightening ring. Louis's men backed up, raising their shields. But there was no space to form a defensive line. No room to maneuver. No escape. Water trickled into the courtyard through a side passage, filling the cracks between stones. The Nile had reached them again. Louis tightened his grip on his sword. Egyptian commander stepped forward. Baybars. His face was calm, his expression unreadable, his voice low enough that only Louis could hear. He told the king that fighting now would not save a single man in that courtyard. Louis raised his sword. Anyway, not in challenge, in defiance. Baybars watched him for a long moment, as if weighing the choice between crushing the last resistance or honoring an enemy who refused to bend. Before either man spoke again, the sky cracked with distant thunder. Not from a storm, from the battlefield outside the city walls. Louis turned. Someone was fighting out there. Someone still holding the line. Someone who had not given up on him. A new sound followed, faint but unmistakable. Another horn. Not the same one. Closer. But the men around Louis straightened, hope flickering in their eyes. Baybars's expression shifted. Not fear. Calculation. Louis realized something in that moment. Whatever was happening outside the city had not been expected. Baybars glanced toward the city's entrance, then back at Louis. He lifted his hand. Half the Egyptian soldiers stepped back, the other half stepped forward. The courtyard held its breath. Louis braced himself.